To call you ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the last time. Now I'm going Vine's route. Buckaroos and buckarettes. May I have your attention? So I will say it worked a lot better when he did it. But anyway, we are ready now for the third panel. And so, and we have the excellent Carla Fredericks is our moderator, and I will now point out that this is our third session. We'll have a tiny break, and then we'll have our fourth session, and then we'll have a reception and get to reminiscing, I guess, at that point. What a lot we have to reminisce about from the state. So, alrighty, Carla.
Thank you, Patty, for putting this conference on. Thanks, Kurt, for keeping us all organized and Center for the American West. And thank you to our panelists. I'll read some bios here in a moment. I have the unfortunate privilege of being the after-lunch moderator. And also the unfortunate privilege of trying to keep to time 3 people who we could spend all day talking to. So I will not take much time here. Since I'm the after-lunch panel, and I had occasion to reread this book, I just really felt that it would be helpful to share some of it with you from Chapter 7, Indian Humor, to wake us all up. Often people are awakened and brought to a militant edge through funny remarks. I often counseled people to run for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in case of an earthquake because nothing could shake the BIA. And I would watch as younger Indians set their jaws, determined that they, if nobody else, would shake it. We also had a saying that in case of fire, call the BIA and they would handle it because they put a wet blanket on everything. This also got a warm reception from people. I've been thinking a lot about Vine. When I was younger, Vine and my dad were really good friends, and I spent time with him when I was a child. And I always thought, because of listening to the two of them, that BIA meant boss Indians around. Okay, so without further ado, we have here in alphabetical order, because how could you possibly do it otherwise with these 3? Dean James Anaya, John Echohawk, and Rick Williams. We'll give about 10 to however many minutes they want without me rudely interrupting them for comments. And then keeping with the interactive nature of the day, really we're looking for questions and conversation here. First, Dean Anaya. No one here needs any introduction, but I will give you a little flavor for context of what we're going to talk about on this panel. Of course, Dean Anaya is the international human rights guru in the room, especially international human rights as pertained to Indigenous peoples. He has numerous publications, including Indigenous Peoples in International Law, and he also now has written the textbook on international human rights. Of course, he served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from May 2008 to June 2014. And before becoming a full-time law professor many moons ago, he practiced law in Albuquerque, New Mexico, representing Native American peoples and other minority groups, including with Indian Law Resource Center. He served on the faculty at U of A from 1999 to 2016, and then we stole him. And he became the dean here, and before that he was at the University of Iowa. Of course, he's a graduate of Harvard Law School, where he's also taught. John Echohawk, also needing no introduction, is Pawnee. He is the executive director of the Native American Rights Fund. He's been with NARF since its inception in 1970 and has been executive director since 1977. So Patty, you're going to have to do the math on the anniversary conference for that. He's been recognized as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal. He serves on numerous boards, including the Association on American Indian Affairs, the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development, the Indigenous Languages Institute, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Grand Canyon Trust. We also are lucky today to have Rick Williams with us. Thank you, Rick, for being here. Rick Williams is a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe. He actually is a former University of Colorado employee, where he was director of the Student Academic Service Center, also director of Minority Student Affairs and director of the American Indian Upward Bound program. Rick is, of course, an experienced educator, advocate, and historian. and he was president of the American Indian College Fund for many years. He also was appointed by George Bush to serve as a member of the President's Board of Advisors on Tribal Colleges and Universities, and he has an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Roger Williams University. So, without further ado, which of you would like to begin?
I thought by sitting in the middle, John would have to go first, but by convention. But anyway, no, it's a privilege to be able to participate in this panel with such distinguished individuals. And again, thank you all for coming to this event. People often ask me, what is good, if anything, about being a dean? You know, what do I like about it? Well, there's a lot of good. There are a lot of good things, but one of the best things, if not the best, is be able to promote and participate in events like these and do it in collaboration with great people and institutions like the Center for the American West and SNICE. So, and then to have great people like Phil Deloria and others come to our law school and engage with us. It really is what makes it worth being a dean and an academic and being alive, I guess, really, I could say, today. So I'm going to talk about what I see as Vine's influence on Indian law, or the law as it affects Indigenous peoples. First of all, he advanced a critical perspective on federal Indian law. Often we talk about federal Indian law as if it's just a set of rules that are applied to Native peoples without much questioning those. And I think really that was the norm at the time he wrote Custer Died for Your Sins. But instead of just accepting these doctrines that are well known to lawyers in Indian law, doctrines that surround the interpretation of treaties, their application, doctrines that include the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of extinguishment or plenary power, the ability of Congress to simply unilaterally extinguish Indian rights and treaty rights. And he looked at these doctrines through a highly critical lens and unearthed their underpinnings in philosophy of the Middle Ages, essentially, arising in the Renaissance period, if you're going to be generous about it, in Europe, and also in a quite bold way characterized these doctrines in many ways as having a overtone or undertone of white racial superiority. And this way of looking at Indian law has really motivated an entire generation to think of Indian law in a different way and move to reform it to something different. This way of thinking about law generally can be seen associated with what we call critical legal theory, that has developed particularly since the early 70s and become pretty standard as a strain of thinking in law schools across the country, including our own law school. And this theory looks at law as located in power structures and seeks to uncover those power structures and understand law in that way, and even leads some to posit, really the mainstream critical legal theorists to posit, that law is indeterminate and really is about these power structures that undergird it. And a variant of this critical legal theory is critical race theory that has developed and again is now prevalent or present in law schools. And this essentially does the same thing, but from a critical race perspective, looking at the racial underpinnings of law and legal structures. Vine was doing this and did this in Custer, before these methodologies and these theoretical perspectives became prevalent. And he was doing it, I just found out, writing Custer while he was studying here for law school, studying here for a law degree. Now, so he can be forgiven for not spending a lot of time devoted to his legal studies. So as dean of the law school, I declare that. So that's quite remarkable, that not only, what did he give a fresh perspective to looking at federal Indian law, and one that motivated thinking about Indian law, and with results in a lot of advocacy that we'll hear about perhaps by the other panelists. But he really was prescient in his approach in foretelling a perspective about the law that took hold more broadly in legal education and legal scholarship. I told you earlier that I first met Vine in Albuquerque. This was in 1992, around then. That was how I first met him personally, but of course, as all of us, we met him through his writings in one way or another. And that's how I really, truly first met Vine, while I was in law school, reading Custer Died for Your Sins. And it was kind of an antidote to much of what I was experiencing in law school. But at the same time, it gave context to what I was hearing in law school from my professors who subscribed to this critical legal theory, critical legal studies perspective. As one of my professors, Duncan Kennedy, is seen as one of the gurus of the critical legal studies movement, and as he would sit there deconstructing tort law, the law of personal injury and so forth, and then I go and read Custer. There was a synergy in that analysis that I took from both of those experiences. Now, a criticism to critical legal studies, the criticism that I hold and advance, is that it doesn't do much with the deconstruction of law. It leaves us empty-handed. Okay, it's all about politics and power. If you're an academic, making decent wages, more than enough to live on, I guess, as many academics, especially in the Ivy League, that's fine. You can say that, right? You can just leave it at that. And that was one of my big disappointments confronted with critical legal studies more broadly. But Vine doesn't leave it at that. He does not leave it at that. He proposes, even if the proposals, some of them are a little off, we might think, especially in retrospect. Just over a week ago, I was riding my bicycle, listening, now you can listen to books, right? I say I was rereading, I reread Custer before this event, but I really listened to it for the first time, but in a sense reread it. And much of my rereading was listening to it on my bike rides to school, and this time I was coming from an event at one of a colleague's house, and it was at night, and here I am listening to Custer Die for Your Sins, and I get to the part on how corporations or extensions or manifestations in some way of tribalism, and somehow also tribes can advance their interests through corporations. And I'm just saying, what? Am I getting this right? And so I'm listening intently. It's at night. All of a sudden, a stop sign comes up. I fall on my side. And so I have a great impact from this book, right, once again. Actually, I did fracture my elbow. You might see me grimacing a little bit. So that's one of the things I bring to this conference, right, that experience. No, but I say that to say that he was very bold in his proposals. And I think, and Phil, I think I got this from what you said, he knew that maybe he wasn't getting it all right, but he was putting it forward for us to think about. Beyond talking about corporations, of course, he had a lot of other ideas, and those are included in the book and in subsequent writings. But what my point is that he was very bold in his proposals and going beyond simply deconstructing the law and talking about how the law should be reformed. Of course, his central thesis was that Indian relationships should be based on treaty relationships, and the full sovereignty of tribes should be respected. And that respect for full sovereignty of tribes should be incorporated within the law, including Indian law. That was his central thesis. And so his proposals for reform in Indian law revolved around that. And along those lines, one of his boldest proposals was that tribes should be, as he termed it, achieve a full status, full status in the international legal system as sovereigns. Now that sounds quite radical, that tribes should be considered fully independent sovereigns within the international system. But he writes about this in his later work in The Trail of Broken Treaties. And he devotes several pages to this, advancing a quite, I would say, pragmatic approach, saying, well, I'm not talking about every tribe going off on its own. It needs to exist or thrive in the context of relationships with the United States, that is, as to the tribes in the U.S., on the basis of treaty relationships, consensual relationships, contractual relationships, as he termed those relationships. So he understood that he was making a quite bold proposal, but at the same time, he was being very studious in looking at the counter-arguments. What would be the counter-arguments? And he one by one ticked through them. The tribes are too small, that they don't have the economic wherewithal, they're not sufficiently advanced in their education, in the larger educational systems and those kind of things. And he addressed one by one, comparing tribes in many cases to other small nations or countries in protectorate status with regard to other countries, making a compelling case, but quite forward-looking and radical none the least. In association with that argument, he posited, or really more than posited, observed that Indian tribes and indigenous peoples more generally are becoming matters of international concern, to the international community, no longer simply matters of domestic concern, subject only to domestic laws. And he pointed to the developments within the Organization of American States, in particular the development of the Inter-American Indian Institute, and criticized the failings of the institute, but at the same time, characteristic of him, proposed how that institute could reform. And indeed, some of the reforms he proposed actually took hold in that institute. Now, eventually, that institute, which was an intergovernmental one made up of state governments, was eclipsed by indigenous people's own efforts. And this, I think, he foretold as well in his writings in the Trail of Broken Treaties, when he talked about how indigenous people's concerns are matters of human rights concern in the international arena. And he referred to the Genocide Convention in particular and talked about how even though at the time, this was the early 70s, when that book was published, The Trail of Broken Treaties, even though the United States was then not a party to it, its ratification in the United States could have implications with regard to Native peoples. Now, the tribes have not achieved recognition as sovereigns within the international arena or membership of the United Nations or anything like that. The Inter-American Institute has gone away. Like I said, it was eclipsed by indigenous peoples. And the Genocide Conventions has not been seen to be applicable to indigenous peoples because of a number of jurisdictional technical matters. However, the central elements of those propositions, I think, have not just survived but flourished and really been the foundation for very important developments on the international plane. Indigenous peoples have achieved a place in the international arena, and there are now institutions within the United Nations that indigenous peoples occupy, institutions that allow the participation of indigenous peoples, not on the same level of representatives of nation states, but some level of meaningful participation. It's without doubt now that indigenous peoples are matters of international concern. You see that throughout the United Nations system, as well as at the regional level within the Organization of American States, numerous activities addressing indigenous peoples' concerns, and as I said, indigenous peoples have access to the national arena. And then there have been a series of norms developed upon the foundation of basic moral, ethical precepts within that rubric of human rights at the international level, and also based on recognition of the suppression of indigenous peoples' historical sovereignty, norms that uplift the self-determination of indigenous peoples. And those are, you may know and likely know, most prominently articulated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which specifically affirms that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, and counsels for relationships between states, nation states, and indigenous peoples on the basis of consensual arrangements. Now, each of these developments can be criticized for insufficient. However, they go in the direction that has been advocated by Native peoples, and that was a direction that was, in a sense, very much foretold by Vine. The last time I saw Vine was a few years before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted. I was involved in the drafting and the development and in the advocacy for that declaration at the United Nations. And during the latter years of the negotiation, 2004, 2005, 2006, it became very difficult, and it looked like we weren't going to be able to cross the line and get that declaration approved by the states of the world. And so the negotiations were very tough, and there was a lot of pessimism. And I had lunch with Vine at a Greek restaurant in east part of Tucson. I can't remember the name, maybe Phil knows what it is. And I was very down, just complaining, and he just smiled through the whole meal. And I said, well, what do you think we should do? And he said, can you pass the salt? Or something like that. And I was like, yeah. And he just said, look, if it's right, just don't worry about it. You just keep going. And that was it. And that's what happened. People kept going, and the declaration in 2007 was adopted by the UN General Assembly. And now I'll just mention this. We have a project here at the University of Colorado in partnership with NARF to move towards to develop strategies to implementing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples here in the United States. Again, thank you very much for coming and for listening to me, and I'll pass the baton over to someone else.
I'm very pleased to be asked to speak at this commemoration here this afternoon, and want to thank Patty and Jim for putting this together and asking me to participate. I have been introduced as a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, but I was born and raised in New Mexico. And I was one of 6 children in our family, and I had a mother and father who were really kind of very strict and insisted that we get our education, get a good education, because neither one of them were college graduates, and knew how difficult life was without that college degree. So we all studied, and we all ended up getting college degrees, and realized that we could do some things with education. And I started dreaming that I could be a lawyer. And that's what really turned out to be something I just never really thought would happen to me. I went to the University of New Mexico, got political science degree, and then, of course, that was just biding time till I got to law school. Went over to the University of New Mexico Law School when I graduated from college, and made sure they got my law school admission test scores and everything, and my application, and gathered up information on scholarships, because that's the way I got through undergraduate school, was through scholarships. And they took a look at me and they said, "You look like an Indian." I said, "Yeah." They said, you got some time to talk to the dean?" And well, I hadn't even been admitted, and I'm already in trouble. So I go see the dean, and then he tells me that the law school there at the University of New Mexico had just been contracted to administer a national program to provide scholarships for Native Americans to go to law school. This was part of the war on poverty, and one of the surveys they had done is that in the whole country there were about a dozen or two Native American lawyers, and to be proportionally represented in that profession, we should have something like 1,000, and we had a dozen or two. And so that's what they were trying to address, was that severe shortage of Native American lawyers. And okay, well, fine. So me and 7 other Native American law students started at UNM as recipients of these scholarships, and to the credit of that faculty there at New Mexico, they figured they ought to include something that might be relevant to us, so they put together one of the first courses ever taught on federal Indian law. And me and these other Native students, we never saw this stuff. We didn't know what this was, and wow, look at all this. Ooh, this isn't happening back on the reservations. This isn't happening at home. What's the deal here? And then we learned about the legal process. And that's basically, unless you have a lawyer, it doesn't matter what's written on the books. You don't have any rights. And we were the poorest of the poor. We had no money for lawyers. And, well, we need to do something about this. This was in the 60s, and of course that's when the civil rights movement was going on. And we see through law school that there's advances made by blacks and through the assertion of their civil rights through the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That's a nonprofit organization and representing poor black people and winning these cases and enforcing equal rights across America. And we thought, well, we need to do something like that. We also got introduced through the faculty to the lawyers that were working in legal services that had been located on Indian reservations. As part of the war on poverty, the federal government for the first time had started funding government-funded legal aid, and some of those legal aid offices got put on reservations. These lawyers from Harvard and Yale come out, and they didn't know about federal Indian law either, but they had to learn about it, and when they did, they started bringing all these fabulous cases and started winning, and we got exposed to all that. The faculty got me a job after my first year out at California Indian Legal Services. I didn't even know there were tribes in California yet. Went out there and got a good experience, and then went back to my second year of law school. After my second year of law school, then I got a internship to work at the solicitor's office in Washington, D.C. in the Indian Division, but that didn't start until late June, so I had a little bit of time. So they had me be one of the tutors for the incoming Indian law class that summer. And one of the students that we had in an incoming class that I got to tutor for a week or two was Floyd Westerman. You know, that singer that Phil was talking about. And, we used to hang around a little bit, and we played some guitar, and one of these songs he broke it. Custer died for you. What's this? And so we all learned about Custer died for your sins in the book, and wow. So we kind of got into it, and it was an inspiration for all of us. Wow, this is the stuff we've been reading about and studying our federal Indian law, and wow, we need to do something with this, and that's exactly what Vine is saying in this book. So wow, we got to do something here. So that fall of '69, my last year of law school, after studying all this federal Indian law and learning about what went down before and learning of the importance of the National Congress of American Indians and Vine's role in that. Just so happens that annual convention that fall of '69 was in Albuquerque. So I slipped out of class one day, and I'm going to go down and see what's going on at this NCAI. And so I slip in, and it's in the Tingley Coliseum, and there's the floor there, and then they have a balcony. So I slip up to the balcony. I don't want to get in the way or be conspicuous or anything. And so I'm sitting up there, the only one on the balcony, watching everything going on. Somebody else comes up there and sits down. Look over there, and I know from the book cover and everything, that's fine, Deloria. Oh, and so finally got up enough courage to go over and introduce myself. And, explain I was third year at UNM and everything, and of course I'd read his book and everything, and what are you doing up here, Vine? Well, I just decided to come down from Colorado and just to kind of check this out and stay out of the way. I don't want to be conspicuous either. So, oh, okay. And so I got to meet him then, and will always remember that. I had hoped to continue working in the Indian law field, and when I graduated, I was fortunate enough to be offered a job at California Indian Legal Services. As soon as I got out there, they told me they just got a grant to start the National Indian Legal Defense Fund, called the Native American Rights Fund. Did I want to work on that project? Sure. Wow, dream come true. We were still under the CILS Board of Directors, but they allowed us to form a National Native American Advisory Committee. So we got together and, let's get some Native leaders to come in here and tell us what are the most important issues, what are the most important cases we ought to start taking on. And of course, wow, we got to reach out to Vine Deloria. So we reached out, and Vine, would you serve on this steering committee for the formation of the Native American Rights Fund? He says, yeah, okay. So over the course of that first year, before we incorporated separately and moved here to Colorado, of course, many of you know we're just located down the street here. We had 2 meetings of this steering committee, and Vine participated and helped us figure out what the priority cases, priority issues ought to be. And I remember in particular 2 issues that he raised. One was the importance of asserting Native American religious rights, and that, of course, ended up being one of our priorities, and I think Rick's probably going to talk some more about that here later. The other one was the development of Indian law. Obscure field, and it needs to be developed, so that became one of the priorities that we worked on as well. When we did incorporate separately and formed our board, okay, Vine, be one of the first official board members, and Vine says, I'm going to have to decline because I've decided to start my own Native organization, this Institute for Development of Indian Law. And because we need to gather together all the treaties and agreements. Lawyers, we can go to the law library and get those, but our people don't really have access to that. We need to get that information out there. So as Phil was talking about, they compiled all those treaties and published them and made them available. And that was the work of the Institute for all those years, and Vine really concentrated on that. That was his organization. Vine stayed in touch with us even though he wasn't an official a board member, because these religious freedom issues were really important to him. And as we started litigating these religious freedom cases and started winning here and there, we all realized that this is really going to be a case-by-case basis if we just kind of continue that way, because nobody knew anything about us, including the fact that we have our own religions. It should be entitled to the protection of the First Amendment just like everybody else's, but it was slow going, so we hatched a strategy to try to get action out of Washington, D.C., national legislation recognizing American Indian religious freedom, and get this information out to all the judges and all the federal bureaucrats and state people. And so we formed this American Indian Religious Freedom Coalition and worked on that for years, and finally got the attention of the people in Washington that we needed. And in 1978, this American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed, and Vine was so pleased that that finally got happened. He was at all these meetings we had with the coalition. He was a real advocate for that, and one of his dreams came true through the adoption of that American Indian Religious Freedom Act. We continued to stay in touch with Vine over the years. It was really great when he came back here to Colorado in the 90s and taught here at the University of Colorado, and had me over to his classes. I was always pleased once in a while he'd invite me to come and speak to his classes about what was happening, the latest cases, because I think, as many of you know, we've been involved in most of the major Indian rights litigation, so and it goes on and on and on. And so I was always really very pleased to do that and to talk with Vine about those things. And it was, during that time I really got to know him well. I even got an invitation to go to dinner at his house one night, and that was really great. And he Gave me a chance to go check out his workroom there. That was fascinating to see how he got it all done. But that same evening, he paid me a compliment that I will always remember. He told me how much he admired what I had done because he knew how difficult it was to be the executive director of a national Native American organization, his experience there with NCAI and the politics and everything. And he says, I don't know how you've been able to hang on this long with the National Native Organization. You've got some special talent there, and I just really admire that. And it just complimented me for the work that I've done and encouraged me to stay with it because that stability in a national organization, he said, it's really, really important. It just keeps people focused and doing the job they're supposed to do. So he said, you keep it up. So I'm still following his advice and continuing on the inspiration that he provided me and all of our people through Custer Died for Your Sins and all the other works that he wrote and published. So again, it's really great to be part of this commemoration, to recognize what a genius he was and how he's really kind of changed our people and really changed America. So thank you.
Can you hear that?
Custer died for yourself, for the tribes you terminated, for the
And it did, for many, many people. I had a very auspicious start in my relationship with Vine. Some unscrupulous people at the university here, when Vine came, told him I was a bad guy. In some ways I probably was, but and that's how my relationship with him began, is that I was considered a misfit, and he was to be very leery of anything that I said. Now, I didn't know that, and being here on campus gave me the advantage of being able to take his classes. And I took every one of his classes that he ever offered here. And it was such an inspirational time for me to learn from him. And it was during this, I think probably the second class that I was taking with him, that he would teach 3-hour sections, and at halfway through he'd go out and he'd have a cigarette. And I went out and was sitting with him, and you could tell he was a little leery of me. But he said, "My truck's not running well." He said, "Do you know a good Indian mechanic?" And Vine was always kind of frugal, right? And he didn't trust other people. So I said, "I'm a pretty good mechanic." And he said, "Will you come over to my house and look at my truck?" So I did, and I did a couple very easy repairs to make his truck run very well again. And all of a sudden, I became godlike in his world. What I loved about Vine was he recognized and supported my belief in animism. In fact, I just love to talk to him about little people and giants and dinosaurs. And his interest in that was very enlightening to me, and his work in that area. Very early on in my career, I worked with John at the Native American Rights Fund, and I had the opportunity to work with Bunkie Echohawk. And during that period of time, we were just discussing a number of things, and one of the things we thought about was the possibility of doing, at least looking into doing a Fifth Amendment taking of a property right, and that property right was the buffalo. And I'd mentioned this to Vine, and Vine was very enthusiastic about it, and he had this passion, and I think probably not a lot of you know about his passion for buffalo, but I took advantage of, by being in his classes, instead of doing the regular writing assignments, he allowed me to do special writing assignments, and one of those writing assignments was the development documents for the Intertribal Bison Cooperative, the bylaws and all of the background for that work, which was, it was fortuitous for me because it was something that I was interested into very much. My Lakota name is Tatanka Huhaska, which is a tall, long-legged bull buffalo, and I've always been fascinated with them. It was in one of these early classes that I talked Vine into letting me write another paper on the history of the relationship between American Indians and buffalo. And of course, if any of you have ever had the opportunity to take Patty's classes or Vine's classes, the rigor was beyond belief. More red ink on your writing than your own words. But that discipline really, I think, benefited me in a lot of ways. So he agrees to sit down with me, and we're looking at this paper that I'd written about the relationship between the American Indian buffalo and the American Indian and buffalo. And in this, I have a graph that shows the demographics of population for American Indians and buffalo, and how before 1900 there were 70 million. At the peak, there were over 70 million buffalo in the continental United States and about 7 million Indian people. And the demise is parallel. The buffalo declined at a rate 10 times greater than American Indians to the lowest ebb at the turn of the century in 1900. There were less than 500 buffalo left in the United States and about 150,000 Indians. And then after that, the increase went back, but it went back in the other direction. Indian people were increasing at 10 times the rate that buffalo were. It was really interesting because there was a statistical parallel between the decline and the reintroduction of and Indian people coming back. And Vine said to me, "Do you know what that means?" He had, sometimes he had this authoritarian voice. And he said, "Do you really know what that means?" And I'm thinking, does it mean that my statistical calculations are wrong? Or, is there, And he said, no. He said, Indian existence in this world is dependent upon the return of the buffalo. Indian existence in this world is dependent upon the return of the buffalo. I'll get back to that in a minute. It's a tremendous honor to be here. Very, very, it's the legacy of Vine Deloria is captured in this room today. That legacy of the growth of the natural native intelligence from that earliest period in the 60s till today. And when we look around the room and we see and we listen to the intellectualism and that natural intellect that has grown over the past 50 years and all of the things that are associated with that, I'm at that age now where I can say, and I can safely say, and look back and say the last 50 years of America and American Indians will have been the most important time in our history ever. That's the legacy of the products of Vine and the work and the development of people in the institutions of higher education, in the legal field. And I cherish that because, I got to be a very small part of that legacy. And, I look at the individuals here and I just, I marvel at, the things that they've done and what's happened. And this really stems from that era of developing both the intellectualism and the pursuit of sovereignty that was grandfathered by Vine. As we all know, we have some challenges that are contemporary, and perhaps we need to be thinking about how we're going to go forward. And one of our biggest challenges, without a doubt, is the care of Mother Earth. And I hope and I pray that we find a way to stop the rape and the torture and the destruction of our mother. We've moved into some arenas that are protecting our Native women and protecting other women, and one of those has to be our mother, the earth. So, do you know what that means? Took me a while, a lot of reflection on what he said. Do I know what that means? Processed it for a long time. Today I realize what it means. Indians' existence, and quite possibly everybody else in the world, is dependent upon the return of the buffalo. Now we think about that, don't think about that in the terms of limited to the return of the buffalo. What he was saying was clear. It was visionary. We have to take care of the world around us. And if we bring back the buffalo, Indian people and other people are going to benefit significantly. That means taking care of the environment, and taking care of our individual people and their existence and their economic development. That's what he was talking about. And it took me a long time to understand that and to make that connection about what he was saying. What does this mean? And that's the way Vine was. Sometimes he asked some of the craziest questions, I think, the last few days that I was with Vine, we had some very interesting conversations, challenging some of the thoughts that people have around interesting topics. We talk about the 7 generations, but my conversations with him were about what is generation? How do you say generation in Lakota? And what does it mean? And it has a whole different context than the version that that has been introduced in our lifetime. And what it is the context of a generation, again, about relatives. So everybody that you would know, for me, it would have been my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, my generation, my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren would compose one generation in Lakota thought. It's not 20 years. It's everybody, all my relatives. It would compose one generation. So if you start to apply those kinds of thinking into 7 generations, and what does it mean? It means forever. And I think that's the inspiration of Vine for me, is that you younger people have got some significant work to do. You've got some challenges ahead of you that that have been similar to the past. And you've got due diligence to do and keep up with work that's been created and started by, your legacies. And so, but I know we're in good hands. And I believe that we are going to be capable of handling all of the political turmoil, the social turmoil. We're already doing good things with languages, and our religion is back. And I believe all those things have been a powerful thing. And what gives me just a tremendous amount of hope and excitement is I have a grandson who's a savant named Vine. Thank you.
Thank you all for those very moving words. Kurt is here with the microphone. We have about 25 minutes for questions. So, question or comment?
After going to law school, did he ever take the bar examination and actually practice law?
Did take the bar.
That's it, yeah.
Did take the bar. He actually had to go into the Goodwill store and get a tie because they turned him away from the exam. Got a tie. Came back, took the bar, passed it, but as far as I know, never really practiced. I mean, in the sense of we understand a kind of practicing lawyer. That he went to go take the bar and they turned him away at the door because he was not wearing a tie, and they sent him off to get a tie, which he got at a Goodwill store nearby. And he came back with wearing the tie and took the bar. Patty just asked if he ever wore a bolo tie. I maybe saw him a couple times in a bolo tie, but not really. Yeah.
I would add, though, that a lot of lawyers called upon him for his counsel on legal matters. So, in that sense, he was a force in the legal profession, and in the context of litigation as well. I mentioned that I talked to him in the context of this declaration that was being developed, and he had things to say before that one conversation. But at that point in time, he just wanted to have a nice lunch. So.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, gentlemen, so with this great legal minds up here and all this experience. So around the globe, it seems like we are seeing some movement with people, including our non-human relatives, plants, animals, the air, the water, the earth itself, as having within legal frameworks rights. How close, how big a struggle is this going to be in the United States? I know I believe some local jurisdictions, cities and stuff have made initiatives to get rights of nature kind of statutes and things, but I think that's really going to be one of the big challenges in terms of a worldview shift if we're going to really address the kind of damage that is going on right now on the planet. So kind of your take on that. Is that something that in your lifetime you think you might see, or is this going to be one of those long struggles?
It's going to be a long struggle. The effort to develop international standards responds to the failures within the domestic arena, and we've seen that in the context of Indian affairs or the concerns around indigenous peoples around the world. The fact that we have these standards for indigenous peoples and increasingly with regard to the environment, and we do see in certain parts of the world the environment or nature having some kind of standing. And the constitutions of Bolivia and Ecuador, for example, have rights of Mother Earth, and those are capable of being litigated in courts. And so there is that movement to have standards, international and following that some domestic standards. But as we've talked about a lot in the context of this project to implement the declaration, it's one thing to see these international standards developed. It's quite another thing to see them actually implemented. And they don't implement themselves. It requires efforts and processes to do that. Another observation is that, a related observation is that the fact that they're not implemented, or we don't see them reflecting reality on the ground, doesn't mean they're insignificant. They are, in a sense, bulwarks for the vacillations that we see domestically. So with regard to the United States, we've seen a retreat from commitment to international human rights and other environmental standards in this current administration. Yet we've seen other actors within the country, including at the state and county or local level, take up these standards and work towards implementing. They still provide a point of reference and an impetus for action in different ways. And there are elections, right? And administrations do change, usually. And those standards are constant as we see these changes. And so it might not happen in our lifetime viewed in the traditional way or the classic way, but if we take the long view, and we've seen what has happened in these areas over time, in the last 50 years, there is a lot of progress, and there's a lot of work to do. And that's, I keep going back to our project with that, with regard to Indigenous rights. I mean, it's coming together. We're trying to bring people together to think about strategies, methods, and techniques to use these international standards to reform law here in the United States. But it's, like I said, a lot of work.
I think in some instances too, the sort of rights-based framework and the agreement to that will follow what's happening pragmatically through legal mechanisms anyway. So we have a case right now where we're working with the Gwich'in people on the coastal plain of Alaska and the Northwest Territories of Alaska, or Canada rather. And they are right now dealing with trying to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from drilling because there was an amendment to the tax bill that opened up the coastal plain and the refuge. And it's highly analogous to the situation with the Lakota and the buffalo because the caribou, the porcupine caribou, and the Gwich'in people and many people of the Arctic have this really interconnected relationship with their animals. And in fact, yesterday, the head of the Gwich'in Steering Committee said to us, we are the caribou. And so at the same time yesterday, the Trump administration's Environmental Protection Agency put out an environmental impact statement about drilling in the refuge. And they acknowledged the importance culturally, socially, on religious grounds, and environmentally of the porcupine caribou to the Gwich'in people. And so you see that being recognized. You don't necessarily see the affirmation of that in international law, but the inseverability of Indigenous people and their animals and their cosmology is something that is already being expressed. What will come of that, I don't know. But I think that I think there's a possibility that some of the conversations, Rick, that you had with Vine, like they will manifest, but just maybe not as the starting point.
I would add that as academicians, it needs to be incumbent upon, particularly in our native schools, that we continue to teach our children that we can talk to animals. Just because people have told us we can't doesn't mean we can't, because we can. We've had that ability, and it's because it's been taught out of us. And I think that I've taught my children and my grandchildren how to do it, and I encourage other people to practice it. Then and only then, when you are treating plants and animals as your relatives? Will they take their rightful place in the world? And we haven't done that as a world for 1,000 years now, and yet in our indigenous communities, they're still practicing that.
And these rights to nature, as Jim was saying, are basically encompassed in this issue of climate change. And I think, as you know, Dan, through the studies by the scientists, that's really fortified by our indigenous knowledge as well. Studies show that if things continue the way they are, that there's going to be vast extinction of plants and animals unless we do something. So the rights of nature are encompassed in this climate change issue, which is before us all right now.
Vine came to my class. I was team teaching with the African historian and the Middle Eastern historian, a course on colonialism and imperialism worldwide. And Vine came to our class, and I had one of my stupider moments in life, and I did not record that visit. But in that class, we could see how much of Custer died for your sins seems to at least echo with anti-colonial statements in Africa and parts of the Middle East, which was amazing to see. And we had him commenting on that. And John, when I was writing Legacy, you had just been to Australia, and you were talking about what you had been thinking and comparing Australian relationships without treaties with Aboriginal people and looking at the U.S. in that context. So I'm just wondering how that comparative history of colonization, which was so fascinating, hearing Vine in that class reflect on that and what he was thinking about the international world when he was writing Custer. And so maybe this is bringing Phil in as well as a response on this, but what happens with our thinking about Indigenous rights if we go into that perspective that you were in, John, when you had been to Australia and were back thinking about that? So just any reflections on what happens when you think about the behavior of colonial powers in different contexts and take them out of the way we usually study those separately by nation and put Aboriginal rights into that big picture. And then I have a much more lighthearted question I want to ask after this.
Indigenous rights is not only an issue in this country, but it's an issue around the world because there's indigenous peoples everywhere. And this work that Jim did, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, even though it took 30, 40 years to get that done, it finally got done. And it's a recognition that these are issues that involve peoples around the world, and it's important. We're involved in this project to basically enforce the Declaration here domestically. It's important, again, as part of what Vine was always saying, people don't know anything about us, we need to educate them. A lot of people don't even know that there are other indigenous peoples around the world, and we all have these same issues. And trying to get the United States to protect our indigenous rights, it's not unique. This is a worldwide issue. And the worldwide standard is to protect these indigenous rights. And it's a continual process of education, and we're developing strategies now to educate presidents about this, congressmen, senators, judges, administrators, state officials, that these are not issues that are unique to America. These are issues that are worldwide, and there's a worldwide standard, and everybody needs to know that. Here it is. Here it is. And our rights are to be protected by domestic laws.
Yeah, the basic structure of the colonial patterns that we see are very similar, and particularly the ones that were in the territories colonized by Great Britain. We see the same doctrines being employed with some variances. In Australia, as you mentioned, that was a British colony, and the British just never got around to doing treaties, but they employed the same idea of discovery, giving some kind of right to the area and to the land. There they call it radical title, right? But it's the same idea that we have here of this limited native title subject to the sovereignty of the United States or the or the European predecessors. You know, the areas that were colonized by Spain or other countries, you know, basically the same ideas. Like again, with some variances. There's a good bit of literature on that. That's very fascinating. But in the conversation I had with Vine about this, he was very cognizant of that. He was very aware, and I think that's what you saw in your class about those common patterns of doctrine and colonialism that occurred, that almost in a sense defined the indigenous world. I mean, who are the indigenous people of the world? Are those who were subjected to the same patterns of colonization and who continue to try to maintain those pre-colonial identities and survive with their intact with their cultures. And those are the indigenous peoples of the world, essentially. They were defined by, in essence, by this negative force of colonialism.
The question I wanted to ask was about your grandson and your son's middle name, and how the names are located and allocated and aligned in the Deloria family, and then names Vine and Philip and so on. So, but I would love to know if this is a trend, that there are a bunch of delightful young folks whose middle name or first name is Vine. Is that happening in the world, or is that so? The other guy I know. Oh, okay. Well, the trend is beginning. Then the trend is underway. So, but I just thought that would be interesting to know how you made your choice and how maybe it's obvious on that. But then, if Phil, if you would listen to their responses and then say a word or two about the names and the kinship system of the Deloria family. So, okay.
Ours was real simple. Our son had a very interesting relationship with Vine. He entered Vine's life at that point where Vine was trying to become computer literate. And my son was helping him in that process. And the crazy part about this whole relationship between those two was Vine would let my son read his unedited versions of his writing, and he would not let me even look at them. I was so jealous, but it was because of that relationship that our son named his son Vine.
That's a great, thank you so much.
And this is Chase again, Chase Iron Eyes. I got into law school in 2004, and our son was born, within a year, very, very quickly after Vine had begun his journey. So, we can, that's a long legacy of passing names down like that, and it's a mark of honor. And so I definitely, I think there's a tradition that's starting here. You can see, I wanted to throw something out there before I'm off this mic, and that is for the panelists too. In terms of when all the, and by the way, just amazing today. Thank you so much for today, everybody here. Vine counseling, or at least putting out there that tribal nations, tribal sovereignty, that angle was a place where we could explore asserting our authorities, because as you know, you can call it federal Indian law, or you can call it colonial rule, however you want to, dance around that. I do a lot of that, a lot of rhetoric, just a lot of talking. There are concepts in colonial rule or federal Indian law that are marked by concepts like domestic dependent nationhood. I mean, when you say that's an oxymoron, right? There's also another concept of implicit divestiture, saying that, because when you're born indigenous, on the other side of colonial rule, every single move you make, there's some obstacle, there's some regulation, there's BIA, I'm not your Indian anymore. You know what I mean? Everywhere we turn, we have to fight. So I want to hear, you know what I mean? I just wanted to add that to the discussion. And we look at Standing Rock, we look at tribal sovereignty and signing the treaties, original sovereignty, and being the foundation for a spiritual awakening on the scale like I don't think we have ever seen in our human history. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you guys to discuss too. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting in the Deloria family. There are a series of names, Francois and Philippe, sort of from the French side, which repeat and cycle periodically. And Francois, oftentimes Sassuet, sort of having Sassuet is people saying Francois Deloyer. Yeah, yeah. No F words, exactly. No Fs or Rs in Lakota. And then, you know, of course, he was Vine Deloria Jr., so my grandfather was Vine Deloria Sr., and for people who don't know where that name comes from, it comes from the Bible, John 15, verse 1. I'm the true vine. My father is the vine dresser. And the story is that when PJ, Philip J. Deloria, my great-great-grandfather, was naming my grandfather, that he opened and this is a moment where if you go through the baptismal records of Native people up there, you find a lot of biblical kinds of names, right? Native people named, Jephthah, and things like this, which are sort of odd. But the story is that he closed his eyes, opened the Bible, and stuck his finger down, and finger landed on John 15:1, and so he named my grandfather Vine. So that is where the story came from. And then interestingly, in the following generations, everyone was named Vine or Barbara. So my grandparents Vine and Barbara, my parents Vine and Barbara, my aunt Barbara, my cousin Vine. So there's been a lot of Vines and Barbaras. My cousin Barbara, my aunt Barbara. There's a lot of Barbaras in our family. What that means, I don't know.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about the book that Uncle wrote that spoke to my heart and spirit, was The World That We Used to Live In.
Oh, yeah.
So I grew up in that, and like I said, I was a wild little Indian girl, and so what I thought was when the Great Mystery would appear out in the sticks and those magical things would happen, I thought that everybody grew up like that. And so those are the things that he talked about in that book. And so in this work that we're doing along the river, we're going back to that. And so one of the things that Rick also talked about is that we've forgotten about those alliances that we had with the Wamakashka. The Dakota word for animals is, I am holy living. And so the teaching was that when you look into the eyes of all of those dogs that he had, you're looking at Creator. And so I am wholly moving, and so I think that we've minimized the power that Wamakashka have. And so in this 12-year-long fight against the Keystone Pipeline, those animals have been appearing. And so they are very much concerned, and they are also getting more aggressive. And so, the buffalo attacks, the bear attacks, and some of it is because of the stupidity of the people. But at the same time, those alliances, many, many stories that Grandpa Vine talked about was when we used to talk to the animals. And we still can, but there's a lot of work to be done. It's not going to be that magical. And I really believe that we need the help of the animals at the state that we're in right now. And at home, what we're trying to do is we're doing a watershed restoration. So we're building this inherent right structure, which is based on the buffalo. And we're not asking permission, we're just building this restorative structure where we will probably invite the Corps to co-manage the Missouri River at some point. But we got to get everything in order. We have a 10-year plan to do that, which I need to talk to you about. But there are things that we can do that the animal world and the spiritual world will help us, but we got to get ourselves. You can't take people and animals where you haven't been. And so they're the things that we need to work on together, and that's the magical world that we still live in.
Yes.
Or Vine responded to it. Even today, Indian rights are stuck in a legalistic limbo from which there is apparently no escape. When a tribe tries to get its rights defined, it is politically shunted aside. Some tribes have gone to the Supreme Court to seek relief against the United States by claiming a violation of their rights as wards. They have been told in return that they are not wards, but, quote, dependent domestic nations. And when other tribes have sought relief claiming that they are dependent domestic nations, they have been told that they are wards of the government. The law really hasn't changed since then that much, so.
Yeah, well, I think think we're finished.
I think I see some questions happening back here.
Yeah, that's a similar topic to what I was thinking about, because recently I was doing some study defining treaties for the Historical Society, and treaties are made between nations. So we're not just talking about Indian tribes, we're talking about nations. So that's why in your earlier talk you talked about international recognition of nations. And I think that's something that most American people are not thinking about, that we're dealing with nations of people and their territory and their rights and their culture and their religions too. So thank you.
Hi. This question is going to sound facetious, but it really isn't. It's very serious. Is there a relationship, going back to the conversation about bringing back the buffalo, what is the relationship between the buffalo and prairie dogs?
They have a very important symbiotic relationship in that the buffalo will, their hooves drive the seeds into the ground, while the prairie dogs are bringing up fresh soil, which are providing nutrients for the land around them. So they live in a very important symbiotic relationship. I mean, it's clear. There's been a lot of discussion around why buffalo are better for the environment than, say, cattle. And there's lots and lots of reasons besides being good for us. One of the things that I think is important that people don't understand is that when we harvest a buffalo, we don't just go out and pick a buffalo and shoot them. We establish a relationship with them, and we will not, according to our ways, we will not take a buffalo until we've made an offering, and that buffalo will turn and look at us and tell us, it's okay to take me. Take me, I'm yours. When we do that, we protect that relationship with the other ones around them. And when we don't, what happens is, if you just go out there and you shoot a buffalo, the rest of them will get around that buffalo and try to protect it, to keep you from gaining access to it and trying to help it up to get away. You know, when you see those kinds of things happening, you understand better about the importance of that relationship of asking, getting prior informed consent from that animal before you take it.
All right, Faith, you're going to close us out here.
Okay. I think it's such a parallel universe of following the buffalo for everybody. But for us, we were told that we have the DNA of the buffalo. And so we are truly like the Gwich'in people. I have a sister up there that is the same type of conversations. The other thing is that I have a nephew who is a herd manager and was for many years at Rosebud. And so I was talking to him about the oral history of the buffalo, and then he was giving me the practical experience of working with buffalo. And he said one of those long, hard winters up north, they were worried about the buffalo getting water. There was a big blizzard, and so they went out and they knocked off some of the ice because all the water was frozen, and they watched the buffalo. And what happened is that the bulls backed off. They circled the whole herd, and they would wait until the first ones who would go drink the water would be the grandmas or the matriarchs. And then the little ones, the little kids would go and drink the water. And the buffalo bulls would wait on the outside till everybody else had been provided for, and then they would go forward. And then with the females, if you ever watch, and I've been out in the field with the buffalo with my nephew, is that when it's time to go to a new grazing area, there'll usually be an old grandma bull or a relative that will walk out. She will lead the group, and then they'll follow her to the new grazing area. And then as far as strategy, he was telling me about this story one time. This was just last winter. We do 4 days of storytelling. We call it Water Lily for Auntie Ella. But he told us a story. He said that the buffalo were near this housing area, and this dog, this crazy dog, he would come in and he would chase the calves. and they think that there was a pack of dogs that was trying to kill the little calves. And so he was watching them one day, and here all of a sudden he came out and checked on the herd, and this dog was part Saint Bernard and part German Shepherd. He was a crazy looking dog, but he was huge. And he came up to the herd, and here they were throwing that dog up in the air. And what had happened, there were two of the herd people that were there, and they witnessed what had happened. But because he was a threat, what they had done is that they, when he started to come in after them, they opened up an opening into the herd. And he thought that he was going to be able to chase the little ones, the dogs. So he ran into that split in the herd, and the herd closed in. As soon as that dog got inside the herd, and the female buffalo went after him and threw him up, and then the bulls came in and finished him. And he got there just when they were throwing that dog up in the air. So that was absolute strategy of that herd. They maneuvered and they took care of the threat. And it was led by the grandmas. And so there's such sophisticated structure. They only will eat certain plants at certain times of the year. They will avoid those for whatever reason. Maybe they need to grow more. Maybe they have certain medicines. But there's certain characteristics in the blood. That's why we drink the blood. But it is it's a keystone species is what it is. And I think that's why it's important for us to make sure, because how we are is how they're going to be, and they're not in very good shape, and we aren't either. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. Thank you all for your powerful words. Thank you again, Patty, for